It's really nice to see so many people here. Yeah, and as Sarah said, I'm looking at digital interpretive technologies, which, I mean, my particular case study is photogrammetry, which we've seen a lot of here. So I'm just wanting to probe a bit further into that and how it's being used and how it can be used. But realizing this is also relevant to laser scanning, to an extent LiDAR, and other technologies that we're using. So I'm just going to outline my main questions, which is, you know, we are collecting loads of this digital data, as has been acknowledged, you know, in pretty much every presentation I've seen. I'm interested in how we're using it as a discipline, and also how this transition from our kind of traditionally taken notes, our, you know, context sheets, etc., and our drawn plans is kind of affecting how we're thinking about the past. So I'm kind of looking at it as a sort of interpretive, theoretical way. So I'm just going to take you through what we're going to do this afternoon. So there's my case study is the Great Kyz Kala in Turkmenistan, which this is the model, one of the models we've made of it. I then carried out a study of some of my colleagues and other heritage professionals and a few extras to find out how they were using it and what they thought of them, and then just try and draw out some results and observations from these interviews. So we'll get into the Great Kyz Kala, for those of you who might not be familiar with Turkmenistan. It's down in the southeast of the country, in the Merv oasis, and it's what's now called a Silk Road city, but it has a pretty long history. It was founded originally in the 6th century BC, but the Great Kyz Kala, the monument you just saw, dates to the later stages of the city, probably built in the 8th or 9th century, and was in use until probably around the time the Mongols sacked the city, which was 1221. But it kind of remains to be seen because relatively little research has been done on it so far. So these are some sort of traditional views of the monument. It's pretty large. It's got this really distinctive corrugated facade, and it was probably again, we're not sure because there's been relatively little research, but it was probably a sort of fortified dwelling, and it's likely that it was sort of surrounded by gardens and maybe other structures. And it is just outside the western side of the Islamic city, so it's not quite within, so it kind of makes sense for it to be fortified. So I'm just going to take you through why we decided to do the photogrammetry. The political situation in Merv meant that we really had very little time on site. It's a very iconic monument in the country. It's on banknotes, it's on a lot of posters, and getting people to decide what to do with this monument, which, as you can probably see, needs quite a lot of intervention in it. And it's a World Heritage site as well. So there's many, many different players in this. Not just, you know, the guys managing the site in Turkmenistan. There's the wider academic community who are interested in these sort of monuments. There's UNESCO are also involved, and there's, you know, interest for tourism and, you know, international development issues in here too. So it's been a really interesting project to be part of because there are so many different competing angles coming in at us. And I've been working with UCL as the archaeological side of this. We're also working with Crater, who are mud brick conservators from the University of Grenoble, and also the Turkmen Ministry of Culture. So it's been a very kind of interdisciplinary project. So I've just made a very quick video of the models. You can play along yourself from your own devices if you wish. I've got the links up there, so if you want to check them out, you're very welcome to go and have a look, and you can manipulate them yourself. It's a fairly standard Agisoft model. We decided to do these digital models because, like I said, we had very little time on site. We had 2 or 3 weeks really for a pretty extensive project. So we decided to make these as the kind of basis of our recording of the monument. So is that music coming from here?
Yeah.
Oh, should have turned the sound off. Yeah, so we decided to record this as kind of our base model, so that we have like plans and elevations, because it's pretty large monument. We wouldn't have had time to record it in the traditional way. We didn't have any survey equipment with us. We had a handheld GPS, that was it, because we couldn't get this sort of stuff into the country very easily. But we did make the first one from a drone, which one of our Turkmen colleagues managed to get to the site. So alongside this, we also traditionally recorded. A couple of archaeologists went in and we took notes. We did things in the manner that you might if you're working on site, sort of following the MOLAS style of things. So we took, essentially context sheets, tried to start phasing some of the archaeological remains, which you can see here, which have been excavated by a local team. So we're not sure. I mean, they're very unclear yet as to what's going to happen with that, if they're going to publish it, where the artifacts are going. They're not on the site. We're not quite sure where they are. So it's very much a kind of record what we can. So we had these models, but we, as many people have commented, it's like often you get a model and you're like, right, well, how are we going to use this? We've found it very useful for discussions, particularly amongst ourselves, and also kind of checking out the conditions of stuff that we maybe didn't have time to note down fully when we were at the site. So I interviewed 11 participants for my study. It's pretty small scale. Most of them were heritage professionals. Like I said, I think 5 of them had been to the site before, and many of them had worked extensively on the site for several years, so they knew it pretty well. And I was quite keen on keeping it fairly informal and conversational, just to, rather than making them rate things from 1 to 10 in terms of how they felt about it, to get them really to drive my thinking on it and how we might be able to use this. So the aims of this, like I say, is to find out how they're using them right now, if they are or not, and to really understand how their use of them might start to influence how we understand these sites, and if they're actually using them to analyse stuff, or if they're just using them as a presentational tool or whatever, and then determine how, as practitioners, we can really understand and prepare for the impact they might be having. And so I'll just take you through the study, who was in it. The nationalities, I tried to have it as mixed as possible. It did kind of have more UK participants just because that's where I was, but had a fair range of nationalities. Their occupations, most of them were heritage. I stuck in I managed to persuade a couple of people who aren't heritage, but have an general interest in sites. So just to make sure that we might think this is a great idea, but anyone who's not, in our immediate circle, then possibly I wanted to get another opinion, basically. And most of them, I have to admit, were quite digitally savvy. But I wanted that in a way because I wanted to see people who were kind of familiar with this technology really telling me what they thought of it and whether it was worthwhile. So my first question here was, do the models actually seem realistic? And do you believe that they represent the monument accurately? And I was pretty surprised that 10 out of the 11 were like, yeah, that seems pretty realistic to me. That's great. That's what I imagine it's like. But there were definite trends in terms of what people said. When I asked them why, what is it that makes you believe that these are realistic? Most of them pointed to either the fact they'd visited the site and it represented accurately what they'd seen there. I guess a lot of them, if we're thinking about metadata, the sort of source and the understanding of the technology and how that's all worked, a lot of it was, that was being pointed at as the reason why. And then a lot of the same things were coming in terms of the monument being accurately represented. So I think the photorealism was a big thing for was it realistic? The textures, the fact people pointed at, for example, that they could see the decay of the structure and that looked realistic to them because they could see the actual erosion processes, which if you were creating it from scratch, you probably wouldn't include, things like that. So that was really interesting to me to find out how you can convince people that this is an accurate representation or in this small study, and also how we can try and sort of make these more realistic. Okay, so the next question was, what do they show and what do they hide? Most people, as you probably, if you've used these yourselves, will realise that they give you a really great aerial overview of the monument itself, and then sort of broadly within the landscape, it really shows you the model in its, the monument in its context. And this can be really useful to see relationships between, internal walls, internal features, but also how people are like moving around the sites and relating from different structures, which was the two biggest pluses of this. In terms of what they hide, which is what I was kind of more interested in, like what are the limitations of these models, the scale was the one that I think 9 out of the 11 said, well, I'm not sure exactly how big it is. Even the people who've been there said, okay, well, I know how big it is, but I'm not sure other people could. And these are obviously scalable models. Because we didn't have a DGPS, we couldn't actually scale them particularly accurately. So we took the decision not to scale them because it was going to be within a few meters, and we didn't want, you never know where this data is going to end up if you pass it over to, say, a government organization. And the last thing we wanted was someone to like formulate a conservation plan based on the measurements from our model, and they were a couple of meters out, and then be a disaster. So that was a big issue, and I think something that I'd like to address, if we're doing these again, even to have something in there, so you have a person or a wheelbarrow or a tree or something that you can actually get a vague idea. The mud brick, this is a mud brick structure, was another big issue because, as someone pointed out, the homogeneity of it makes it really difficult to tell variation within the structure, as you might if you're on the ground. So, for example, there's a couple of walls in this monument that have been reconstructed, totally reconstructed. And one of my participants pointed out that you can't actually tell that from the model. But I did have one archaeologist who looked at it and he said, oh, those walls look really odd. What's going on there? Are they real? Are they fake? And so I have a feeling that if, these sort of visual cues you get on the site, these sort of ways of seeing that we learn as archaeologists might be transferable in a small way, at least, to these models. If you're sort of trained to see in an archaeological way, you might be able to transfer that. And then the detail was an issue because it's, I think if they're usable models, you can't actually get that great detail, or I couldn't at least. So I'd be interested to hear from you if you can. And then the subtlety was the one I didn't quite know how to describe, but one of the archaeologists said, well, I know from the site that's not natural, but in the model you can't tell. So there's definitely a series of senses that you get on site, gut feelings, particular changes that you just can't see from these models. And in terms of how people are using them, most people pointed to outreach, presentation, and teaching as the major pluses of these models, which I would agree with. I mean, the best thing about these is you can see the site really quickly. But the conservation team that we're working with have been brilliant in giving me feedback on how they're using them, and they've been using them a lot we have the possibility of, like, as many people have mentioned, monitoring change. This monument is changing rapidly because a lot of interventions are happening in the country that no one else is being told about, and it isn't particularly visited. So if we can get them to kind of monitor it for us, and then it's not the easiest country to get to, we can really start to understand how the monument is kind of reacting to the conservation or the excavations that are going on there. And that's really important to have, I think, kind of specialist access to that. So specialists looking at this stuff to point out, if there's something going a bit awry. And then there's the site assessment and reconnaissance. One of the surveyors I interviewed said, this would be great to have this before you even start excavating a site. If you could have this just as an in to understand how the site is in its context, how you're going to access it, and stuff like that, it could be really useful for. And then moving on into 3D printing, computer games, I think, these could really be useful. And I've seen a few presentations that have started to address these issues, which is really cool to see because it's kind of a step ahead of where I am, definitely. The great thing about this study was that the conversational nature of it kind of threw up a lot of issues that I didn't see coming. This is just one of the comments I got, which is really interesting because the participant kind of thought the model was objective. He didn't mind, he had no worries about the modelling process, which I think a few of us might have more to say about. But he was worried about whether the excavations that it showed were real, if the archaeologist had excavated it correctly, because you can't interrogate that in these models. And we have been using these to make plans of the site and extract the orthophotos and actually get some pretty good, useful data out of them. So that's an issue with the objectivity of it. But I think this kind of illustrates it quite well. Then the representation, that's often the issues you get with these if you're trying to model changes through time. One of the heritage managers that I interviewed said, well, you've cropped out a lot of the information. I cropped out this really ugly staircase, you can see, because it's horrible, and it really affects, I think, your understanding of the model a bit. If you see a staircase and you're like, if you can't tell what it's made of, you're like, well, is that real? What is that? It's a metal staircase that was inserted about 10 years ago, so I thought I'd get rid of it. And then the other thing is this drainage pipe that they've added in, which I cropped out as well. But he was like, well, if I'm managing the site, I really would like to know everything about it. So your cropping out of things is potentially not useful, or at least you have to note what you've cropped out. So again, we're kind of back to metadata and how we classify this data. And then this connection thing. Someone said, well, it's just a load of pictures. I really, I don't really understand. It's a model. I don't like this as a way to explore the site. I'd much rather be there. I get far less out of it. And I think there's this sort of sense of specialism that you have to be trained to use these models. Do you? I mean, I think many people would disagree. Do you need to be a specialist to learn how to interrogate them? I mean, it's a visual thing. So, but I was interested in someone saying that because obviously for them, it was really a specialist thing. And they were kind of wary of getting into something that they weren't necessarily feeling they could comment on. So my conclusions. I'm interested in whether there's a widespread acceptance of these. My study certainly showed the people I interviewed accepted fairly readily that these were realistic, they were accurate, and they had no problems with that. But I think that's because, I was there, or I could explain my process to them. If they were like, well, how did you do this? How did you take the photos? What does this actually do? I think having that conversation with them really helps. And again, if you're doing it on a much larger scale, I mean, how do you convince people? Again, it's like metadata, which we will kind of grapple with. But I think we're kind of over that now. But it's, I guess, choosing what you put in there. Then the overview. Oh, and I'd like to carry on and maybe speak to a few people who aren't as digitally literate, and maybe look at people who don't look at spatial data, so historians that are interested in this period, maybe international development people, something like that, just to see how they feel about this, whether they would accept it as readily as we kind of do, or the people I interviewed kind of do. And then in terms of the overview, I mean, these really do offer a unique way into landscapes that we haven't really had before. We've had Google Earth, but being able to actually look at the angles that you can see this from. A few people said, this is amazing. I've worked at the site for 10 years and I've never seen it from this angle. I've never looked at it from that monument. So in terms of figuring out how people looked at landscape, moved through the landscape, being able to look at lots of sites kind of in reality in a much visually easier way to see than maybe through GIS, is potentially going to, I think, really change the way we think about some of these sites, and the potential for objects as well. I mean, we had the great talk from the Recre guys about how they are, 3D modeling all these objects. And I just think that if you're able to look at, hundreds of objects together, even if they're not, the real objects, there's a chance to get into these objects and these sites in a way that we haven't had the opportunity to do really before on such a large and easily accessible scale. And then the communication, these have been invaluable. It's so invaluable to us because we have several different nationalities working on the site, lots of different first languages. We're often in different countries at different times. And if we want to discuss stuff, these models have been so useful to be like, oh, do you remember what it was like a year ago? Yeah, okay, we have this model. And, do you know this entrance on the eastern side, or which one's the eastern side? So they've been really, really handy. And I think as an interdisciplinary, as an interdisciplinary project, and then for archaeology as a whole, where we're constantly sort of pilfering ideas and ways of doing stuff from other disciplines, this is a really, really great communication tool that, people can talk in non-specialized, in specialized ways, but not using specialized terms, using visual references. And I really think this could help drive, disciplinary advancement, I guess, into amalgamating new ideas into our work. However, it is definitely complementary to a wide range of other data. I mean, a model on its own is never going to help you. So I think collecting these in collaboration with other data, whether it be the traditional context sheet style stuff or photographs with scales in, or just our sort of general recording toolkit that we have as archaeologists, I think is really really valuable to keep all this stuff together. And these are brilliant as a sort of starting point, as a kind of base model, as a way to discuss and sort of almost remind yourself what's going on at the site. So I think the kind of much maligned, here's my model, check it out. I think there's a lot of ways into that, and a lot of ways we could be using this stuff. And I think as the technology is kind of advancing, and as we start using these and become more possibly familiar with them, we really are going to get so much more out of them than we ever thought we might. So just going to say a thank you to UCL and Crater, who are working on the site, and thanks to the University of York for hosting my masters and giving me all these great ins and ideas, and also to the Turkmenistan Ministry of Culture for letting us at their sites. So thank you very much.